All right, welcome to the latest episode of We the Individuals Live. That is my dog barking in the background because he doesn't follow anybody's rules except for his own because he is an anarchist, so I apologize if you can hear my dog. At We the Individuals, we believe in the novel proposal that we each choose our own manner of being governed. If you are not familiar with us, please follow us at Facebook and at Liberty.me, both under We the Individuals. With us, as usual, we have Jeff Peterson II, who is the founder and co-owner of We the Individuals. We have, for the first time with us, Sterling Reese. And, of course, I am Chris Calton. You can follow me on YouTube or on Facebook at AnarChris as well. It's very clever. You can't steal it. I have it copyrighted. And with us today, we are very happy to have Dr. Peter Klein. He is a professor at Baylor University and a research fellow with the Mises Institute and an all-around swell guy. He is the author of the book, The Capitalist and the Entrepreneur, which we are going to talk about some today. I just read through this a little bit, and it is tough on my level of economics, so I'm really excited to learn some stuff. I'm going to tell you a story before I start asking you questions, Dr. Klein, because I told you beforehand, I was at Mises University this past year. We had another young man who was going to be on, one of our friends, Blaine Kelly, who was also at Mises University with me, and when we were at Mises University, I don't think you remember this, but I did the oral examination with you and Thomas DiLorenzo and I forget the name of the third guy, and I did very, very poorly, of course, because I don't know economics at all, and I immediately left and went to my friend Blaine, who was supposed to be here, and he told me everything I said that was wrong, and he was who we were going to have come in here and make us all look smart, and so I'm really counting on Sterling to do that. Because I know Jeff and I aren't going to make us look smart. So if not, then we're going to have a really elementary interview, and we're going to learn some interesting things about Austrians and firms, right? Because that's your expertise.
You did very well in that exam, by the way. I mean, it's a pressure-packed environment, but you really held up great.
Well, I appreciate that. Okay, before we talk about your work on firms and the Austrian theory of firms, if I'm even saying that right, I don't know. I speak broken economy, so I do my best. Let's talk about Mises University. You have been doing Mises University since, you said, '88, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Can you tell us about that experience, what brought you to them, and how you got started?
Oh, sure. So I attended my first Mises University, although we didn't use the name Mises University back in those days. I think it was called Summer Instructional Conference in Advanced Austrian Economics or something like that. That was right before I started my PhD coursework in economics. And I had heard about the Mises Institute really the old-fashioned way. You know, for your younger listeners, they may not realize that there was a time before we had the internet, and people would put flyers and posters up on bulletin boards. I guess they still do that. And I had seen a flyer on a university bulletin board advertising Mises Institute, conferences, scholarships, and so on. I had already been reading a little bit of Austrian economics at that time on my own, and I was planning to go to grad school and get an advanced degree in econ. And I was shocked to find out that someone had named an institute after Mises. I had never met anyone who was interested in Austrian economics, anyone who knew who Mises was or had read Mises, Rothbard, Hayek, etc. I was sort of, I thought I was maybe the only one still on the planet, like, Will Smith in that movie. What's the movie where he's the last man?
I Am Legend.
Yeah, I thought maybe I was the Austrian legend. And then I saw this flyer and realized there was a Mises Institute, and I applied for their conference. And then I went in the summer of '88 and met Murray Rothbard, Hans Hoppe, David Gordon, Roger Garrison, and a lot of the other, folks whose names you know today. And so I attended the first few years as a student. Then when I finished my degree and began teaching as a professor, I was able to participate in the conferences as one of the speakers. So as I like to joke, I've been to, what is that? How many conferences is that now? 20. I think it's been 23 or 24 in a row for me, and I think I'm finally starting to get this stuff.
Start to understand. Well, follow-up question. You obviously you mentioned a lot of these big names in Austrian economics, but the one that we're always interested in is Rothbard. You actually did your fellowship when he was the senior research fellow or something of that nature.
Yes.
Can you
He
tell
was
us about
the
that experience?
academic director or vice president for academics.
Yeah. What was that like working under him?
Oh, it was incredible. I mean, I'm sure you guys and most of your listeners, you've probably seen videos of Rothbard. You've maybe heard him on heard him on tape, and you've heard people tell stories about him. You know, just the Rothbard that you meet through his writings, Man, Economy, and State, and America's Great Depression, and all his hundreds, maybe thousands of newspaper columns and short pieces. You know, he comes across as this very erudite,
Right.
brilliant sort of scholar, systematic, deep thinker. That's all true. But in person, he was a whole nother kind of awesome because he was this really hilarious guy, little short man, full of life, always telling jokes, laughing. You know, I can't imitate the Rothbard laugh as well as other people that you can probably find on YouTube. But I mean, he really had this incredible charisma, and just to be around him, you were kind of sucked into his world because of his enthusiasm. You know, you combine that kind of enthusiasm and charisma with his level of knowledge and understanding. I mean, I've never met anybody else quite like him, and I've known personally more than one Nobel Prize winner. And I mean, no one compares to Rothbard in terms of sheer brilliance and force of personality. I also had the privilege of being an assistant to Rothbard when he was the editor of the Journal of Libertarian Studies, which gave me insight into just the scope of his knowledge. Because people submit manuscripts on all different topics related to libertarianism, and he would make these evaluations and critiques and do editing work on these manuscripts. And I mean, he just sort of knew something about everything. In fact, he knew a lot about everything. And so he was really a figure who inspired me, not to duplicate what he has done, of course, but to try to make my own little contribution in my own way, to try to further the project that he was so instrumental in starting.
Well, good, because it seems like you've done that with your work on firms and Austrian theory as applied to that. And I've got some questions about that. I told you beforehand. I hope they're not too elementary. But can you give us a brief overview of what you've brought to the literature in your collection of essays, The Capitalist and the Entrepreneur?
Sure. So my main area is applications of Austrian economics to to business and production and entrepreneurship and innovation. So I'm interested in business cycles and overall economic growth and political theory and so forth, just like all of us are. But I specialize in the more micro topics of applications of Austrian theory to what companies do, how companies interact with each other, how they deal with their customers, where do companies come from, why are they big or small, how do they grow, how do they innovate, and so on. And that's an area that has not historically received as much attention from Austrians as more macro topics, maybe more sort of regulatory issues. Look, I mean, Austrian economics, like any other field of study, has sort of evolved in dialogue with other, sort of ideas that are important at the time. So when the Austrian school was first founded by Karl Menger and his successors, they were in dialogue with Marxism and with so-called institutionalist theory, and they were trying to show that no, markets actually, markets do work. Marx's theories, aren't adequate for explaining how capitalism works and so forth. Mises developed some of his most important ideas in opposition to socialists. Mises wrote about why socialism is impossible. Well, today in 2016, I mean, there's some, but there's not a whole lot of people who openly identify as socialists. That's why the whole Bernie Sanders thing was so remarkable.
Because we're starting to get that again.
Yeah, I mean, you might say, well, Hillary Clinton's policies have a socialist aspect to them. That'd be true. But there are not many people who, openly praise Marx and Lenin, as there were, in generations past. So the point I'm making now is the area of Austrian economics that most excites me is applications to the network economy, the internet economy, the emphasis that we all place now on rapid technological change. Our devices and our apps, and companies like Google and Microsoft that didn't even exist a decade or 2 decades ago. To me, that's something that Austrian economics has a lot to say about, and it's an area that I've devoted most of my attention to.
Yeah, you mentioned a couple things that I think I was thinking about when I was reading through some of the essays. One of them, you mentioned Mises and his critiques of socialism, and in one of the chapters that I read that I was really intrigued by was the one where you applied I think it was chapter 1, actually. I'm looking at my notes, and I have really poor notes, but it was where you applied the socialist calculation contribution that, of course, Austrians always invoke as a critique of socialism. You applied that to the theory of firms and how, let me let you explain it because I'll butcher it probably.
Oh, no, you're doing absolutely great. And what I did in the chapter that you're referring to was really just extend an argument of Rothbard's to point out that, look, when Mises explained why capitalism was preferable to socialism, as I said, at that time, that was a really live issue. And Mises wanted to show that socialism is not an economically viable system. But really, Mises' argument about why socialism cannot work is just one application of a more general argument, a more general understanding that Mises has about how a market system operates. And if a lot of your listeners may be familiar with this argument already. You guys are. You certainly are, Chris, from hearing it at Mises U. But essentially, Mises says, under socialism, the state owns all resources. The government owns the means of production. There's no private property in resources, natural resources, machines, buildings, land, and so forth. So there are no markets for those things. There's no market for land. There's no market for machines. There's no market for capital goods, natural resources, and so forth, because the government is the sole owner. So therefore, without markets, you don't have market prices. Without market prices, there's no way for socialist planners to know what's the most effective way to accomplish any objective that they have. Notice, Mises isn't saying socialism doesn't work because the socialist leaders are evil. He doesn't say socialism doesn't work because there's too much corruption. He doesn't say that the bad people will get on top, though those things are all true. Mises says, look, even the best-intentioned socialist dictator has no way to know whether a factory should be here or here, whether we should make automobiles using robots or using human labor, whether we should have a railroad that goes to this point or to that point, what to use to build the railroad, steel or gold for the rails, labor-intensive production, capital-intensive production. Under capitalism, the entrepreneur makes those decisions by, through cost accounting, right? How much does it cost to produce this way? How much does it cost to produce that way? I go with the least costly option. But of course, to do that, you have to have some numbers to account for the cost of doing things in different ways, because you can't add up heterogeneous objects. You need a common unit in which to, so you can add up the total cost of doing it one way or another way. That's what the price system does. In other words, Mises says you need prices for all factors of production to be able to rationally allocate resources to their highest valued use. And under socialism, you don't have that. What Rothbard pointed out, and I sort of elaborate on, is, look, this argument doesn't only apply to socialism. It would also apply, for example, to a voluntary cartel. So a lot of people worry, oh my gosh, Walmart is so big. What if Walmart takes over all the other retailers and all the other manufacturers, and what if Walmart is the only company on earth? And that's going to happen if we don't have strong antitrust, or we don't have the government stepping in and stopping Walmart. Walmart's just going to take over the world. Rothbard's argument, or Mises' argument, says, okay, let's suppose that happened. Suppose Walmart took over all other retailers, and Walmart is, the sole producer of all clothing or all electronics. Then, even though there's no coercion involved, there's no formal socialism, that gigantic firm is also going to lose the ability to make decisions based on market prices. Right? If Walmart is the only computer producer and only computer retailer in town, in the world, then Walmart has no way of knowing whether to make this kind of computer or that kind of computer, whether to produce computers this way or computers that way, whether to make them out of steel or make them out of plastic, whether to make them large or small, because there are no market prices for those inputs, because Walmart owns all of the inputs, so there's no one to exchange with, right? So there's no prices. In other words, what Mises is saying is that to have rational allocation of resources, you need markets and prices. You can't have a single owner of all the resources of a particular type, whether that be a socialist dictator or a voluntary cartel of capitalists or a single, CEO. That system is not going to be feasible. So in other words, the bottom line is we don't have to worry about Walmart taking over. We don't have to worry that Google will soon own the entire universe. We don't need antitrust. We don't need government watchdogs. We don't need Ralph Nader or whoever or Bernie Sanders to keep a close eye on these big companies to make sure they don't screw us over. No, they're limited in size and scope and power, quote unquote, by market forces.
Right. So, and Jeff has a follow-up question, but I want to clarify something real quick beforehand. What you're looking at is the fact that when a business owner, say, he purchases his capital, and then what the other economists are arguing is that they're allocating this or distributing it within their firm by fiat, and you're saying, well, yes, sort of, but they still need those prices for that rational calculation on the individual business level. Is that correct understanding?
I mean, look, I can, of course, organize in a private property regime. I can acquire property, and I can use that property in whatever ways I see fit. Here I've got a pen in front of me. Nothing stops me in a free society from attempting to manufacture any kind of pen that I want. But, of course, also nothing guarantees that I will receive revenues in excess of my costs, right? I can't force a crappy pen on the market and make people buy it the way the government can force you to, patronize their services whether you want them or not. So I'm limited by market forces in the kinds of products that I can produce at a profit. Right now, I might just be, maybe I inherited $10 million from my parents. I can blow it, right? I can produce whatever stupid products I want until my $10 million runs out, but then I'm stuck, right? Unless I can find some crazy person to loan me money. So yeah, I mean, this is an argument kind of in the same spirit that yes, companies like Google or Walmart or whoever, they can try to become as large as they want, but there are natural market forces that limit the extent to which one firm or one group of firms can take over a market, can take over an industry, can suppress competition and so forth. Only the state ultimately can suppress competition, though of course the state doesn't. This doesn't benefit society. This makes us all much poorer, right? But private entrepreneurs in a free society, they simply don't have the ability to manipulate the market, to manipulate the consumer, to impose their will on people the way that people who don't understand capitalism seem to think.
Jeff, what was your follow-up?
Yeah, it was really, since you're talking about the knowledge problem, the question was that if you would be able to kind of you were talking about the socialist economic calculation problem, if you can kind of distinguish the differences between the knowledge problem and the economic calculation problem, because I feel in my way that Mises answered everything, and no disrespect to Hayek, but I feel that Hayek didn't answer as much as a little bit more of a watered-down version of the economic calculation problem.
Well, I would put it this way. I think Mises and Hayek are offering distinct arguments. I think Hayek's argument is complementary to Mises' argument, but I agree in a sense it's not sort of as fundamental. So by analogy, it is true that under actually existing socialist regimes, the socialist dictators have all been evil, crazy nutcases, right? Really horrible, bad people. And theoretically, we can demonstrate, and Hayek does this in Road to Serfdom, why it's very likely that in a politicized system, the people who rise to the top will be the Hillary Clintons and Donald Trumps of the world, right? Not necessarily the best people. So, yeah, I mean, it is true that under socialism, you tend to get bad people running the show, but Mises is trying to offer something more fundamental. Mises is saying, yeah, that's true, but even if you had the best people, the smartest people, the most well-intentioned people running the system, it still wouldn't work, right? Hayek's argument is a little bit like that in the sense that Hayek points out quite rightly that, you know, even a well-intentioned dictator would not have the knowledge necessary to, you know, produce the things that people want, right? So, you know, should we have, you know, what's a silly example? The Olympics are on the last couple of weeks, and I actually have the Olympics have made me mad in many ways, but you know, and people are complaining about the coverage of the Olympics in different countries. In the U.S., the NBC network has done a pretty lousy job with its coverage. You know, let's say a socialist dictator wants to show games on TV for the people. You know, well, how should you do it? What time of day should you show the games? How do you deliver what kind of commentary should you have? You know, to maximize overall happiness among the population. I mean, that's just an impossible problem to solve, right? Because there's no way that the dictator, the decision maker, could know everything about everybody who wants to view the games and their preferences, and there's no way to aggregate that into some meaningful decision. It would just be arbitrary. That's an example of the knowledge problem. And it's absolutely 100% correct that the dictator under a socialist regime does lack the necessary specific knowledge, particular knowledge of particular circumstances of time and place that would be necessary to make any kind of meaningful judgments about what the society should do. But Mises grants even that point. Mises says, imagine that the knowledge problem goes away. Because Mises says, suppose that we don't care about everybody in society. Suppose that the only thing that matters is the dictator satisfying his own personal preferences about what should be produced. You know, the dictator likes choo-choo trains. The dictator played with choo-choo trains as a child and really loves locomotives, and the dictator has decided we're going to have locomotives that run from Moscow, you know, to Leningrad, and that's the only thing that matters. That's the welfare criterion for society. The dictator gets what he wants. Mises says, even in that situation, it is impossible for the dictator to allocate scarce resources in a way that give him the most railroads, the best railroads, the railroads that he wants to satisfy even his own desires. So in other words, Hayek's argument is a good one. And, you know, it may be enough to say to the socialist, hey, the knowledge problem means socialism is not feasible. I mean, maybe that's a conversation stopper right there. Great. Just as you could say, hey, under socialism, you get evil, crazy dictators. Maybe that's enough. You don't have to go any farther. But if your opponent, the person with whom you're in dialogue, says, no, but I've got a reason why I think good people would run the show. You say, okay, fine, I'll grant you that. What about the knowledge problem? Well, suppose that your opponent has some way to get around that. Well, the knowledge problem isn't relevant. Who cares? You know, all that matters is that the enlightened elite get to have their preferences satisfied. Even then it doesn't work because of Mises' argument about the impossibility of rational allocation of resources without prices, for which you need private property, for which you need competition, decentralization, and so on. That's kind of a long-winded way to answer, Jeff, but that's, you know, the way I think of how these two arguments relate.
That's a good explanation. Sterling?
Yeah.
Okay, I've got a question, and this is one that I get from a lot of our minarchist fellows. That since there are no purely socialist economies, that, you know, we always have a mixed economy. Couldn't governments just choose among market alternatives for their inputs, or calculate using their current prices for those goods when, you know, trying to decide, well, should we go with asphalt or pavement, or, you know, when building the roads, which we all know could not exist without government. So.
Oh, sure. I mean, look, Mises' argument doesn't say, you know, there's no differences in how socialist economies operate. right? So on the one hand, imagine, Kim Il-sung or something. Imagine that it really is just a total nutcase at the head of state. He's just doing completely random things. There's this great old Woody Allen movie, which I recommend, called Bananas, back when Woody Allen was funny, when he did more slapstick comedies. And it's about this fictional Latin American country that has a revolution, kind of like a Cuba-style revolution. And there's like a Castro type of revolutionary leader who overthrows the right-wing dictator and sets up some kind of socialist utopia. And then he like totally flips out. He starts passing these laws, for example, that from now on everyone must wear his underwear on the outside of his clothes. He just kind of like totally flips out. I mean, yeah, there's a difference between that and I don't know, so the Soviet Union under Gorbachev or something, right? Where the guy wasn't completely insane, and maybe the guy was using some common sense in making resource allocation decisions. Let me do your question a different way. Sometimes when I explain this to my students, I use Mises' example of building a railroad, which I already mentioned. So should you make the rails out of steel or should you make the rails out of titanium? Well, in a market system, we know that the market price of titanium is very high compared to the market price of steel. So it's a better use of scarce resources to make the rails out of steel rather than titanium. Titanium, there's not much of it. It's much more scarce. It has more valuable alternative uses, and you can infer that from the price being high. That's why it doesn't make sense to use titanium. Sometimes a student will say to me, "Well, duh. Everybody knows you use steel. You don't need economic calculation to know that steel is better than titanium for building railroads. Everybody knows that. It's just common sense." Yeah, but I mean, the reason everybody knows that is because we were all brought up in a market economy that has those prices, right? So imagine this. Say there's the revolution. Let's say the U.S. There's the communist revolution in the U.S. on in September 2016. And September 1st, 2016, we go 100% socialist. I mean, everybody around is still going to have the memory of what the world was like on August 31st, right, when we did have markets and prices. And for a while, for a few months, a few years, maybe even a few decades, right, that information will still be useful in guiding resource allocation. It's not as good as actual real prices that change every day and so forth, but it might be better than just sheer guesswork. But Mises points out, but over time, as technology changes, as population changes, as consumer preferences change, entrepreneurs, rise and fall, individual decision makers get old, and new people are born, and so forth. That information is going to be increasingly irrelevant, and so at some point in the future, yeah, I mean, it's almost just sort of totally arbitrary again, right? The information of the distant past, the distant capitalist past, just isn't useful anymore. Sterling, to give you yet one more way of thinking about it, people sometimes have objected, well, if Mises is right, why didn't the Soviet Union just collapse right away? You have 1917, you have the revolution, and by the early 1920s, you have the rudiments of the communist system in place, and it didn't go away till 1990, 91. How did it manage to survive so long if Mises was right? If socialism is impossible, as Mises says, doesn't that refute Mises? The argument is no. I mean, the reason that the Soviet Union was able to survive as long as it did, the reason that Cuba has survived for so long, the reason that North Korea hasn't completely vanished from the face of the earth, is because they're surrounded by capitalism, right? I mean, in fact, we know exactly what they did because we now have the archives on this. I mean, what the Soviet planners did is they woke up in the morning, in the 1950s or something, and they opened the Wall Street Journal and they looked to see what's the market price, what's the capitalist world market price of steel and coal and oil and whatever, and they just plugged that into their estimates to make their calculations, right? If the communists had gotten their way and we had complete global communism, then the whole society might have collapsed in a week.
Yeah, exactly. I've got another question. What do you think? Do you think the advance of technology displacing government in terms of services like Uber, or Murray Rothbard put a high stock in the education of people.
Mhm.
That we've got to be out there, sort of bringing the message to them. What do you think of those two things will be the better cause of what reduces government influence in our lives?
Well, that's a great question, and I mean, I don't really know. I don't think anybody knows for sure because this is sort of speculation about the future. But I mean, you're right. Look, there are two different philosophies on this. You know, what people like Mises argued and Rothbard argued is that, look, you have to educate people. You have to make them understand, at least to some level, the benefits of the market. But there's always been the kind of opt-out alternative, and it's even precedes, modern technology. People who say, look, well, let's just withdraw into the woods and form our own little libertarian society, or find an island, or the seasteading movement, right? Let's just create our own little libertarian society far away. I mean, is that technically feasible? It's got a lot of drawbacks as well as advantages. But what you're pointing out is there's another way to kind of, if not totally secede, at least circumvent the state, which is by using technological means, using ride-sharing, private ride-sharing services instead of state-licensed taxis, purchasing things with Bitcoin or whatever instead of using the state's money, homeschooling your kids instead of sending them to school. I mean, I think those are all terrific developments that should be applauded, and to the extent that it is feasible to do that, I think I'm certainly all for it. But I guess I'm of the view that ultimately, in the long run, we're not going to get the kind of society that we here on this call would prefer without at least some degree of public understanding or acceptance, right? Because I mean, you see, well, shoot, even not too far from where I live in Texas, the city of Austin, which is an hour or so from where I live, the city council of Austin, under great pressure from the taxi unions and other do-gooders, has banned Uber, right? Uber is illegal within the city limits of Austin. Uber and Lyft have been outlawed effectively. Look, there are kinds of encryption technologies that maybe the government cannot shut down even if it wants to, but government can make it pretty difficult for all of us, even as we're trying to live our own private existence, kind of under the state's radar. So yeah, to the extent that we can chip away at the influence of the state through bypassing its, it and its preferred, its partners in crime, yeah, I think that's great, but I don't know that that's going to bring about long-run social change without some kind of ideological revolution too. Bob Higgs has made a good point recently that we have to remember the state employs huge numbers of people, right? There are in many countries, even more, more than in Western societies. What are all those people going to do when the technological sort of utopia comes about? I mean, let's say everybody just starts using Bitcoin, and the feds want to shut it down, but they can't shut it down. Nobody's using Federal Reserve notes anymore. Well, the Federal Reserve System has tens of thousands of employees. Are they just going to go home? No, I mean, I think they're going to do something, and some of those people have guns and badges and tanks or whatever, and they're going to lobby their friends in other branches of government who have weapons and tanks and so forth. I think they're going to do something to try to make life difficult for those who want to circumvent the system. Can they completely shut it down? Probably not, but they can certainly make things pretty unpleasant for those of us who are not part of the system. So I think we have to keep in mind that there are a lot of people in society who have a vested interest in statism. Not only those who are directly employed by the state, but lots of private individuals and firms that benefit from the state. Goldman Sachs doesn't want libertarian utopia either.
Yeah.
What's Goldman Sachs going to do when we start, not using their products anymore? I think they're going to work hard to get us back, and not, by making us happy either.
Yep.
Well,
No, I agree with that totally. I had like a quick follow up. Do you think the overall sort of arc of history is in our favor in terms of, when I look at Divine Right of Kings, and I look at the Magna Carta, and I look at what happened with the American Revolution, what I see is a gradual erosion of sort of the myth of uh, kings and presidents and democracy, and as a legitimate form of basically telling people how to live their lives. I see it as, at first it was, well, God told me I'm in charge, so I'm in charge, and then people stopped believing that, and then how do you see that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I can only give you some kind of personal reflections and insights. I don't claim to have a definitive answer on that. Um, in many ways, you're right. And I mean, I was kind of brought up, as most of us were, with the kind of traditional Enlightenment view that, that we had way back in the Stone Age or whatever. People had no liberty or freedom whatsoever. We had a little bit of, in sort of the classical era, we had the rule of law from Rome, and we had development of modern, pre-modern kind of ways of thinking from Greek civilization and so forth. And then we went into this horrible statist Dark Ages. Then we had the Enlightenment, and ever since the Enlightenment, things have gradually been getting a little bit better. I mean, a lot of historians don't really buy that timeline anymore, that the Dark Ages really were not that dark, and that in many ways there was substantial personal autonomy and liberty. There are people like Rodney Stark and Joel Mokyr and a lot of other scholars, historians, and so on, who've kind of questioned that narrative. So frankly, it might be that a 9th century peasant somewhere in Europe actually had more liberty on a day-to-day basis than you and I do, de facto. Yeah. It's really hard to make a comparison like that. But I mean, look, let me put it this way: there's a lot of reason to be optimistic. The fact that we're having this conversation now, that we can use this technology, we can use Google Hangouts, which is a free service, to have a discussion about libertarianism and to discuss arcane points of anarcho-capitalist theory. I mean, most people in human history couldn't do that, right. And they didn't have the opportunity to kind of spread the word the way that we do. So, I mean, there's certainly a lot of reason to be optimistic. Are things going to get better in the next year, 5 years, 10 years? That's hard to say. I try to, I think Murray Rothbard described himself as a short-run pessimist but a long-run optimist. And I think that's kind of a useful framing. As long as we continue to have these conversations, as long as we continue to develop these ideas and share them with others, and fight every day, also on the technological side to circumvent the state, there's going to be progress. It's probably not going to be smooth and continuous. And as I said before, the state and its allies will fight back. Ultimately, I don't know how it's going to turn out, but it's certainly worth the fight.
Jeff?
Thank you.
Yeah, so I mentioned before the show what really got me into wanting to talk to you and bring you on was the back and forth that you had with Roderick Long on the size of firms. Now, one of many libertarians' favorite topic is what a stateless society would look like. Many left libertarians on the left who I'm large critics of will say that in a stateless society it'll be basically predominantly co-ops. And do you have any reason why to suspect why that notion is flawed, or what's wrong with co-ops, strictly co-ops, as opposed to firms with hierarchies?
Right. So, I have nothing against co-ops, voluntarily arranged co-ops. Just as a footnote, most co-ops in the Western countries in the United States are not sort of pure market institutions, but we can come back to that. The general issue that you're raising is an important one, and it's a difficult one, a challenging one for our theories. It hasn't been discussed as much as the socialist calculation debate or Austrian business cycle theory or whatever, but it's a useful way, I think, of getting at a little bit of attention within the libertarian community. Right. So on the one hand, as libertarians, we tend to we don't like authority because we associate authority with the state, right? We want freedom and liberty, and we want decentralized solutions. We want to be able to do our own thing without the interference of the state and so on. That tends to inculcate in many libertarians, a kind of anti-authoritarian, kind of a radical streak, a libertine streak, which is perfectly fine. But remember, libertarianism is not, the way I understand it, pardon me, it's not exactly about freedom from restriction or freedom from constraint.
Mm-hmm.
Libertarianism per se is about private property, right, and the absence of state coercion. So libertarianism per se supports libertarian theory, political theory, argues in favor of a world of private property. Now, what do you do on your private property? Well, I mean, you may organize your private community, your private organization, your private group in a number of different ways, right? And those ways could be hierarchical. Here's the example I like to use is, can Amish people be libertarians? And some of my left libertarian friends tend to think, well, no. I mean, look at an Amish community. It's very traditional. They're anti-technology. It's extremely hierarchical. It's very patriarchal. It's extremely politically incorrect. They're very traditional gender roles and age roles, and the village elders have to decide everything. The kids don't have any authority. I mean, I've seen the movie Witness, right? You guys probably have too. Oh, okay, I'm being a little bit facetious. But, if you associate libertarianism with kind of liberty in some abstract or broader sense, you might think, well, that's not libertarian at all. That's a very authoritarian kind of community. My view is that an Amish community can be, and in many ways is, an exemplar of a libertarian community if everything is done on voluntary terms, right? So if people voluntarily, because of their culture, their religion, their history, their tradition, want to organize themselves in that way, right, Chris? If you and I want to go off into the woods somewhere and set up a community where you're my elder, you're my boss, you're my father superior or whatever, and I say, look, Chris, I respect you. You have more experience than I do. I think you have a lot of wisdom. I'm going to defer to you on most things, right? As long as I have chosen that kind of role, as long as you're not coercing me in the sense of state coercion, you don't have a gun to my head. Mm-hmm. I'm free to leave if I want. If I choose to stay, to me that's perfectly consistent with a libertarian. That is a libertarian community in the sense that everything is done voluntarily, by consent, and under a regime of private property. The point I'm making is, look, it's quite possible, and I would say even likely, that in a stateless society, not everyone would want to be, have this sort of high degree of personal autonomy.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, people would probably want to organize themselves in families.
Mm-hmm.
People would get married or have a significant other, or maybe more than one significant other. I don't know, as happened throughout most of human history. And in a marriage or some other kind of long-term relationship, there's a kind of mutual voluntary submission, right? Children they defer to the authority of their parents and grandparents and so forth. I don't see any reason that would change under a stateless society. In fact, it's quite possible that there would be even more of that kind of traditional clan structure in a libertarian order. So there's a roundabout way of saying, I think the issue of sort of hierarchy versus autonomy is a different issue. That is not the same issue as the issue of freedom versus coercion as libertarians understand it. So in the absence of coercion, people might very well organize themselves into hierarchical structures like large companies, big families,
I always use churches as an example.
Yeah, I mean, it's not at all obvious to me that the kinds of social groupings that we would find in a purely free society would be very horizontal and flat Jeff, you asked specifically about co-ops. I mean, I can follow up with information about some ideas about co-ops particularly, but I just want to make the general point that what many libertarians, sort of left libertarians, view as the kind of ideal form of society under freedom, one that's very flat and everyone is sort of equal and people deal with each other at arm's length and no one outranks anyone else. That's not part of libertarianism as I understand it. That's a totally separate issue, and I'm not convinced that society would be like that if we had a purely free sort of in the absence of the state.
My favorite criticisms of is basically the economic problems co-ops would run into.
Did you get that?
Oh, I'm sorry. Could you? I didn't catch that.
I'll repeat it because Jeff, I think your mic's acting a little up. He was asking specifically about economic co-ops. I was actually kind of wondering this myself. I mentioned that I always use churches as my example of governance without government, where you got pastors and deacons and elders. But then I think I wish Andy were here because I'm going to mention Josiah Warren. I mention him every interview it seems like. So he's the take a drink name. But Josiah Warren writes about hierarchy. Of course, the socialists love to claim him, and he was very pro-hierarchy, but it was kind of a different thing than these, like church, neighborhood type clan communities where he was talking about people establishing a hierarchy in a business, in a co-op, where you're working for an income, essentially. And I think that's, Jeff, is that what you were asking about, kind of?
Yeah, it's... I think that with co-ops, I think that with co-ops that left libertarians always want to point to the knowledge problem via Hayek and say this is why hierarchies would not be as existent and there would be flatter firms. But I think that they don't look that the knowledge problem kind of swings both ways with co-ops.
Yeah. But the other problem is, look, the knowledge problem is not a trump card. I mean, all forms of organization have to deal with knowledge problems in some ways, but there are incentive problems and all kinds of organizational challenges that are not directly associated with the knowledge problem. For example, let's talk about co-ops in particular. A cooperative is a legal form of organization in which the owners of the firm, the equity holders of the firm, or I should say, in which ownership is tied to patronage of the firm's products. So there could be a consumer co-op like a grocery store where the co-op is owned by its customers, and the extent to which you own equity in the co-op depends on the extent to which you purchase from the co-op. You get points or whatever for everything you buy. The camping store, the outdoor products company REI, is a consumer-owned co-op in that sense. You get points when you buy stuff on REI that give you ownership claims on the company. A lot of agricultural cooperatives are tied not to purchases but to sales, right? So you can have a suppliers co-op like an ethanol plant where a group of corn farmers, they pool their resources to create a plant that takes the corn that the farmers produce and transforms it into fuel. And ownership of the co-op is a function of how much corn you sell to the co-op, right? So there are also worker-owned co-ops where the firm is owned by employees and ownership is tied to your employment status with the firm. Again, in a free society, those are all perfectly legitimate organizational options, but they're not panaceas. There's nothing magic about that kind of organization that makes it work better than a hierarchically organized corporation. In particular, right, one of the great things about a corporation is precisely the fact that ownership is not tied to purchases or sales or employment, right? So if I own shares of stock in McDonald's, right, but I hate to eat McDonald's food, I'm still free to own shares of stock in McDonald's if I think that's a good investment or I have some ability to help McDonald's make good decisions or whatever. If I decide I want to eat at McDonald's more or eat at McDonald's less, I can do that without it affecting my status with the company. And if I decide, hey, McDonald's is not looking like a good investment for me anymore, I don't want to own McDonald's, all I have to do is sell my stock, I can still eat at McDonald's if I want, right? If McDonald's is a consumer-owned co-op, the only way you can get in as an owner is by eating a bunch of McDonald's food. And if you want to get out, you can't eat McDonald's food anymore, right? Now you have conflicting interests. You have your interest as an owner, where you want to maximize the return on your investment, and you have your interest as a consumer, where you want to get food that you like at low prices. So if I'm if I am an owner of a consumer co-op, do I want the prices to be high or low? Well, in my capacity as a consumer, I want prices to be as low as possible. In my capacity as an owner, I may want prices to be higher if that leads to higher profitability. I have conflicting objectives, right? So my point is there are a lot of theoretical and empirical studies of patron-owned firms, whether they're owned by suppliers or customers or employees, and these studies show that a lot of the times they don't work very well. These conflicts of interest where people wear multiple hats lead to inefficient governance. They lead to poor performance. And yeah, I mean, large corporations have a lot of problems too, but co-ops have problems. There's nothing magical about a flat structure that makes all of the, that makes them more profitable, more efficient. I mean, that's just simply not the case.
Okay, we're coming close on time, but I wanted to talk a little bit about academia before we close up. Sterling had a good question on that. I'm going to let him go before mine. Sterling?
Yeah. As a teaching professor, would you say that acceptance of Austrian economics and libertarianism, and I realize they're not the same thing, but would you say that those ideas are becoming more accepted, or is it still largely marginalized? How do you see that?
Yeah, I think Austrian economics is making good progress. I think Austrian economics is more widely accepted within the academy than it was back when I first started, especially, ironically, sort of in fields outside of economics proper. Within the economics profession, the sort of neoclassical orthodoxy maintains a pretty tight hold. But in allied social science fields, sociology, political science, history, in business administration, management, finance, accounting, entrepreneurship, and even to some extent within economics proper, there's a growing acceptance of Austrian ideas. Even some mainstream types recognize that the financial crisis doesn't really fit within the mainstream account, and the Austrian business cycle theory seems to work pretty well in understanding the housing boom and bust and the financial crisis and recession. And so I think that's opened a lot of people's eyes, or at least made them a lot more willing to consider the Austrian explanation.
I had one follow-up thing that I was going to bring up about academia. It came out of your book as well when I was reading through it. Obviously, a lot more, since Ron Paul, a lot more young people are going to graduate school for economics that are interested in Austrianism. So I wanted to bring up, you mentioned a research gap in your book, talking about the provision of capital to small entrepreneurial ventures compared to larger ones. Can you elaborate on that? Because I'm sure we'll have some people watching this that might benefit from it.
Yeah. Oh, sure. Well, I mean, that's one of the greatest challenges in a market economy is how do you match, people with resources to invest and people with great ideas, but, a need of resources to bring those ideas into fruition. And, we know a lot about how large companies do it on public equity markets. But we don't know as much about how smaller firms do it in a more private setting, meaning, getting loans from friends and family, trying to find angel investors and venture capitalists, looking for, other ways, crowdfunding and so on, ways of getting smaller amounts of capital, but getting them more quickly and in a more streamlined and low-cost fashion than, having an investment banker and going to the New York Stock Exchange and so forth. That's another one of these great technologies to go along with Uber and Bitcoin and these other ones we've been talking about, the ability to raise money through crowdfunding, and including equity crowdfunding, which is kind of a new thing. I mean, that's a great way that entrepreneurs and prospective entrepreneurs can quickly get access to resources without having to go through, sort of the government-sanctioned and approved financial sector. So I'd like to see more people doing research on that.
Well, then what we just need to do is find one of our Mises University students who wants to get a PhD in economics and just send him to you for a dissertation in that area, right?
Absolutely. I'd be delighted to work with somebody on that.
I'm sure that'd be exciting. Okay, I'm going to ask my final question, and we're going to wrap up. I gave you the list before the interview, but I always ask everybody I interview the best book recommend. If I can only read one book, excluding those already mentioned, what do you recommend?
Well, of course, anything by me would be my top choice.
Of course.
The books you've already mentioned are all terrific. I just would add one to the list. I don't know that it's the best book in Austrian economics, but a book that I really like, which relates to the issues we've been discussing today, is a short book by Mises called Bureaucracy. And it's
the
not
first
as
book
well
I ever
known.
read by him.
It's not as well known as his other books. It's published in 1944. It's short. It's pretty easy to read, and it's mainly about it's about hierarchy and large companies and the things we've been talking about. But he has a great discussion of the socialist calculation debate. And in fact, I think it's the clearest presentation that Mises gives anywhere of why it's so important to have private property and free markets. Before he talks about how bureaucracies work, he talks about how the free market works, and it's a great intro to Mises thinking, and it's short and easy to read, and you can get it for free on Mises.org.
I'm really glad you mentioned bureaucracy. I'll tell you a quick story. I live in West Virginia, and in our House of Delegates, there's a guy that I met when he came and spoke to the school. We developed a friendship. He's a delegate in a district that I don't get a vote in. Very much a Rothbardian, and he texts me pictures holding up like For a New Liberty when he's listening to some conservative socialist in our state talking. So obviously we became great friends. One day after we'd known each other for a little while, I get Bureaucracy in the mail. I have no clue where I got this from. So that's like his favorite book. He actually mailed that to me, and it was the first Mises book I ever read. This is before I was an Austrian. This is when I was just a free market, I guess, quasi-free market guy that didn't really know what was going on. So Bureaucracy was my introduction to Mises.
Oh, that's great.
100% agree with that recommendation. I've been waiting for somebody to recommend it.
I didn't know that, but I'm glad to hear it.
Yeah. We need to wrap up. So, Dr. Klein, thank you so much for coming on. This has been a wonderful discussion. I really enjoyed your lectures at Mises University as well. If anybody is interested, those, of course, are on YouTube at the Mises YouTube channel. So all these lectures are available. Very much well worth your time. As anybody who watches this regularly knows, we don't do these interviews on regular schedules, but keep up to date on the Facebook page and Liberty.me, We the Individuals, because we will do these interviews anytime we have somebody to come on and they're worth watching. I'm not going to tell anybody what the other books that Peter Klein was referencing were, because you have to watch all of our old interviews to get everybody else's book recommendations, but they're all up on Liberty.me's YouTube channel. So other than that, everybody have a good night, and thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me on your show tonight. Keep up the great work, guys.
Thanks, Peter.
All right, good night.
Thank you.
Good night.
Night.